When war broke out in Europe in early September 1939, all 5 ships of the King George V class were under construction, and over the course of the upcoming 2.5 years, all 5 would be in service. After King George V and Prince of Wales were laid down, it was clear that Japan was not going to be signing any further naval treaties with the West, and Germany by this point was also constructing battleships, so Britain decided to follow up the King George V with an improved design that had greater offensive power. This resulted in the Lion-class battleships, with HMS Lion and Téméraire being ordered on the 21st of February 1939. Those 2 would then be followed up by Conqueror, which was ordered on the 15th of August 1939, and finally, Thunderer had a shipyard assigned, but no order contract was ever signed. In February of 1939, when Lion was ordered, it was expected to be completed in mid-1942. However, it was clear that the production of its armament and turret mounts would not be ready in time for a completion date of 1942, so the ships could not be expected until mid-1943 at the earliest. Britain's capital ship fleet was in a difficult spot when war was declared on Germany in September 1939, as several ships were undergoing reconstruction, while others were on schedule for reconstruction, and, with the Japanese clearly being aggressive in the east, the British expected that they would need to separate their forces between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. At that time, the British also expected that they would need to send a couple of capital ships to the Mediterranean to assist the French fleet in containing the Italian navy, but given another year, the British would have to contain both the Italian and French navies. The holdup on the Lion class was clearly in the development of its new weaponry, so it was recognized by the Director of Naval Construction, Sir Stanley Goodall, that Britain needed to build battleships with an armament that was already in production, or, in this case, an armament that was already constructed and awaiting installation. In the 1920s, the large light cruisers Courageous and Glorious were converted into aircraft carriers, and between the 2 ships, 4 dual 15-inch 42 caliber gun mounts were removed and placed in storage as reserves for the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge class battleships. These turrets were never needed, and were still sitting in storage when the Second World War began, and so Stanley Goodall suggested constructing a new battleship using Courageous's and Glorious's turrets. It was also recognized that in 1942, the first of the Revenge-class battleships would reach their maximum age limit, and thus would be decommissioned, so upon decommissioning Revenge, its turrets would be removed and installed aboard a second ship of this new idea's design. The Royal Navy's Plan Division accepted the concept and submitted it to the Naval Staff, whom would also accept it and authorize further development. On the 17th of July 1939, the first 3 designs, 15A, 15B, and 15C, were submitted for consideration. The armament and armor for all 3 of these designs was identical. They differed in hull shape and propulsion machinery. 15A was essentially a copy of the King George V, except it was slightly enlarged to allow the installation of a 4th main battery turret. 15B was effectively a copy of 15A, except it was made even larger so that a more powerful propulsion system could be installed, allowing for a greater speed. 15C was the same hull design from 15B, but the propulsion system was the one that was designed for the Lion class rather than the one for the King George V. This allowed for a more compact arrangement of machinery, but without losing much speed compared to 15B. The Board of the Admiralty favored design 15B because of its higher speed, however, they selected 15C for further development because of time constraints. When war began in September 1939, design work was temporarily suspended, along with the construction of the first 2 Lion-class battleships, while the second 2 were cancelled. On the 3rd of December 1939, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, wrote in a letter that he was enthusiastic about the development of the design with 15-inch gun mounts, as it would be an intermediate design after the completion of all the King George V-class battleships and before the completion of the Lion-class battleships. As a result, design work would resume in February of 1940, and design 15D was completed. 15D was effectively design 15C, with some slight improvements, the main improvements being splinter protection added throughout the entire length of the citadel, armor protection for the secondary 5.25-inch mounts being increased, and a conning tower was added to the after superstructure. These alterations increased the expected displacement by 1,500 tons. 15D was subsequently approved on the 20th of May 1940, but further work on the project was then suspended until October of 1940, and by that point the project had fallen behind. As a result of this delay, John Brown and Company of Clydebank, whom was the projected builder, supplied personnel in order to make up for the lost time. Over the course of the next year, John Brown's team would assist the Royal Navy in finalizing the design, and more alterations were made as a result of war experiences. The ship's fuel capacity was increased to allow for a greater operational range. This subsequently resulted in the overall dimensions of the ship being slightly increased, which meant it could no longer pass through the Suez Canal, and it could no longer be docked at Rosyth or Portsmouth. Short-range anti-aircraft weapons would also supplement the medium battery of 2-pounder pom-poms, and there were slight armor increases throughout the ship. Unfortunately, the alterations in the ship's dimensions messed around with stability calculations, and so armor on the ship's side belt was slightly reduced. This design was submitted on the 17th of April 1941, and it had an increased displacement of roughly 500 tons. The design was approved on the same day, and authorization was given for John Brown to begin the manufacture of components for the construction of the ship, and on the 2nd of October 1941, the keel to what would become Vanguard was laid down. When the keel was laid down, it was expected that the ship would cost £5.2 million to construct. However, in May of 1941, the hunt for the Bismarck showed several shortcomings in Royal Navy capital ships, and in December of 1941, 2 months after the keel was laid down, the Prince of Wales and Repulse would be sunk in the Pacific, which would show even more design faults in Royal Navy capital ships. This would result in a series of redesigns to Vanguard while it was under construction. Firstly, the ventilation system for the forward boiler rooms had a significant flaw in the event the ships took splinter damage. Splinter holes that were created in ductwork around the forward funnel could draw funnel gases back down into the boiler rooms and potentially poison personnel, so it was decided for Vanguard that the air intakes should be moved into the forward superstructure, and the ductwork would then be rerouted on a path away from the funnels. Secondly, in the cruise galley, electric-fired ranges would be used instead of oil-fired, which allowed the galley to be split into 2 compartments, so that if one took damage, there was still a galley in operation. Thirdly, the bridge structure for Vanguard would be rearranged in comparison to the King George V's as a result of wind test on King George V's superstructure and combat experience. The forward high-angle gun directors were also rearranged to allow for greater flexibility of control. Fourthly, there would be an increase in anti-aircraft defensive armament, and this would result in an increase in crew complement, so accommodations, gear stores, freshwater tanks, and provisions had to be increased. Fifthly, the cupolas of the secondary armament were increased in size to allow gun crews to remain at their battle stations for longer periods of time. As a result of this alteration, the hydraulic pumps were removed from the revolving barbette and placed in the fixed structure of the ship. Sixthly, in order to protect the magazines from splinter damage caused by underwater hits, the ship's underwater compartmentalization was slightly increased, and the splinter protection for the main longitudinal bulkheads would be made out of 1.5-inch non-cemented armor plate of single thickness. The increased compartmentalization of the lower hull would also help contain progressive flooding, which was a primary factor in the loss of Prince of Wales. As a result of the new arrangement for the bulkheads, various crew spaces also had to be altered, with bathrooms being moved, side scuttles below the upper deck being greatly reduced in number, and the ammunition handling rooms for the numbers 2 and 3 5.25-inch gun mounts being moved from the lower to the middle deck. That change in specific would add several months onto the ship's construction. Seventhly, the bow shear was increased, and the side plating was redesigned to allow the ease of water flow around the ship's structure, and the anchor stowage was redesigned to minimize spray over the bow. Finally, the longitudinal separation between the inboard and outboard propellers was altered. On the King George V class, they were 33.5 feet apart. For the Vanguard, they would be increased to 51.5 feet. This was as a result of a torpedo hit on the Prince of Wales. All of these alterations were completed on the 7th of September, 1942, and this was the final design for the Vanguard, and from here on out, it would simply be construction. The ship's overall length would be 814 feet, its overall width would be 108 feet, its standard displacement draft would be 32 feet, while its full load draft would be 35 feet. Its standard displacement would be 46,102 tons, with a full load displacement of 51,420 tons. The ship would be equipped with 8 Admiralty-type boilers, operating at 400 psi, and 4 sets of Parsons single-reduction geared turbines, delivering 250 RPM, with the entire propulsion system operating at 120,000 shaft horsepower. This would give the ship a top speed of 29.5 knots, and an endurance of 6,000 nautical miles at 20 knots when operating in foul weather. The main belt around the magazines would be 13.73 inches thick, and 2.75 inches thick around machinery, while the armored deck would be 5.88 inches over magazines and 4.9 inches over machinery spaces. Even though the main battery turrets were left over from Courageous and Glorious, they would see several improvements. The elevation of the guns would be increased from 20 degrees to 30 degrees, and the armor would be increased on the face to 12.75 inches, the sides to 8.82 inches, and the rear to 6.86 inches. The increase in gunnery elevation allowed Vanguard to have a maximum range of 32,100 yards, and at this range, its penetration was superior to that of the 16-inch guns aboard the Nelson-class battleships, and the penetration characteristics were superior at all ranges when compared to the 14-inch guns aboard the King George V class. Much like the King George V, it would have 16 5.25-inch secondary guns in 8 dual turrets in 4 pairs. The ship would also boast 76 2-pounder pom-poms in 9 octuple mounts and 1 quad mount, along with 24 Oerlikon machine guns in paired groups. With the characteristics having been finalized, construction work continued, and the ship was launched on the 30th of November, 1944, and commissioned HMS Vanguard on the 9th of August, 1946. Its sister ship was cancelled before it was even ordered or named. With Vanguard being commissioned in 1946, it was the final battleship the Royal Navy would construct, and the second final battleship to be commissioned, as France's Jean Bart, was not completed until 1949, though its design and construction began before the Second World War. Thanks to Jean Bart's design and construction work having begun before the Second World War, we can look at Vanguard as being the final battleship in history that was designed and constructed. The nation that started it all was also the one to finish it off. With that having been said, there's nothing more to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.